Welcome to Life Stories, where we share tales that inspire, move, and transform the way we see the world. Today's story is about an unlikely partnership that begins with a calculated deal but unfolds into a journey of love, redemption, and the true meaning of legacy. What happens when a wealthy businessman and a struggling artist come together to create a life, only to find their own lives profoundly changed in the process? Stay tuned, as this story will remind you that even the most unexpected paths can lead to the most beautiful destinations. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to start today's journey. John Carter sat alone in his expansive penthouse, the city lights of Manhattan stretching out before him like a galaxy of ambition and triumph. At 45, John was the epitome of success. His name was synonymous with wealth, power, and innovation. The skyscrapers of New York City mirrored the empire he had built, a world of polished steel and glass, as impenetrable as his own demeanor. But on this particular night, as he stared at his reflection in the window, he felt the creeping shadow of emptiness. It wasn't a new feeling, but it had become harder to ignore. For years, John had poured himself into his work, believing that every milestone achieved and every deal closed would fill the void inside him. 2 marriages had come and gone, both dissolving under the weight of his emotional detachment and his partner's unmet expectations. Love, he had concluded, was a distraction, an illusion that blurred judgment and led only to disappointment. He had long since decided that emotions were weaknesses, something to be controlled or, better yet, avoided. Yet tonight, something gnawed at him, a quiet but persistent thought that wouldn't let him rest. His legacy, the empire he had spent decades building, would end with him. He had no one to inherit it, no one to carry the Carter name forward. The realization had begun to haunt him, tainting the satisfaction of his achievements. What was the point of amassing all this wealth, this influence, if it would disappear when he was gone? The answer, he decided, lay in creating an heir, not through the messy entanglements of love or family, but through a plan as precise and controlled as his business ventures. He would have a child, but on his terms, clean, straightforward, and devoid of emotional complications. For John, this wasn't about creating a family, it was about ensuring that his legacy continued. He envisioned it like a transaction, a deal that both parties would benefit from. He would find someone who needed what he could provide: stability, security, and a chance at a new life. In return, they would give him what he needed: a child to carry his name and inherit his empire. It was a bold idea, perhaps even audacious. But John was no stranger to taking risks when the stakes were high. As he poured himself a glass of scotch, the plan began to take shape in his mind. He would need someone who fit a specific set of criteria, someone willing, capable, and desperate enough to agree to his terms. They would need to be strong, resilient, and unencumbered by attachments. It was a tall order, but John had always believed that with enough resources, anything was possible. After all, he had built an empire from nothing. This would be no different. For a moment, he hesitated, the enormity of the decision weighing on him. But then he reminded himself of the alternative: a life of fleeting relationships, of hollow victories, of a legacy that ended in silence. No, he wouldn't let that happen. He would act. And he would succeed, just as he always had. The next morning, John's resolve hardened as he stepped into his sleek black car, the roar of the engine echoing through the underground garage. As he navigated the bustling streets of Manhattan, his mind churned with possibilities. Where would he find someone who fit the bill? How would he approach them without arousing suspicion or misunderstanding? Lost in thought, John barely noticed when the traffic light ahead turned red. He braked sharply, the car coming to a smooth stop at an intersection near downtown. It was then that he saw her. She was sitting on the sidewalk, hunched over a piece of paper with a stub of charcoal in her hand. Her hair was messy, falling in uneven strands around her face. and her clothes were threadbare and ill-fitting. But there was something about her, a quiet focus. A sense of purpose that seemed incongruous with her circumstances. Despite the chaos of the city around her, she was completely absorbed in her sketching. As if the world didn't exist. John frowned, his gaze lingering on her longer than he intended. It wasn't pity that held his attention. John Carter wasn't a man prone to sentimental thoughts. It was something else entirely, an unnameable quality that drew him in. Like the faint outline of an idea waiting to be defined. The light turned green, and the impatient driver behind him honked, jolting John from his thoughts. Muttering under his breath, he accelerated, leaving the scene behind. But as he drove, the image of the young woman stayed with him. Who sketches on a sidewalk like that? He wondered. The question gnawed at him, and a few blocks later, he found himself slowing down again. This was absurd, he thought. Irrational. And yet, his instincts that had never failed him in the boardroom, told him to turn around. So he did. When he arrived back at the intersection, she was still there, her charcoal moving swiftly across the paper. She leaned the sheet against the wall, her movements precise and confident despite the grime on her hands and the weariness in her posture. John pulled up to the curb and rolled down his window. The sound caught her attention, and she looked up, her blue eyes meeting his. "Hey," John called out, his tone direct. "Come here." The woman hesitated, her gaze wary. Slowly, she rose to her feet, clutching her drawing tightly. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice low but firm. John studied her for a moment, noting the stubborn set of her jaw and the intelligence in her gaze. "I want to talk," he said. "Get in the car." Her laugh was dry and mirthless. "I'm not one of those. If that's what you're thinking. Don't be absurd." John snapped, irritation flaring. "I don't have time for that. Just get in. I have a proposition for you." The ultimatum hung in the air, and for a moment, she stood frozen, her suspicion unyielding. But there was something in his tone, a promise or perhaps a challenge, that made her reconsider. With a resigned sigh, she opened the passenger door and slid into the seat, her movements cautious and deliberate. As the car pulled away from the curb, John couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made the most important decision of his life. The silence in the car was thick, broken only by the hum of the engine as John maneuvered through Manhattan's crowded streets. Emily sat stiffly in the passenger seat, clutching her sketch tightly as if it were a lifeline. Her blue eyes darted between John and the cityscape outside, wary and unreadable. "What's your name?" John asked, his voice calm but firm. She hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of the sketch paper. "Emily," she said cautiously. "Emily," he repeated, nodding slightly. "I'm John Carter." If Emily recognized the name, she gave no indication. Her gaze remained steady, skeptical. "What do you want, Mr. Carter?" she asked, her voice edged with suspicion. John allowed himself a faint smirk. Her directness intrigued him. "I told you, I have a proposition," he said, glancing at her. "Something that could change your life." Emily raised an eyebrow, her skepticism deepening. "And why would a man like you care about someone like me?" "Because you have something I need," John replied, his tone matter-of-fact. "And I have the resources to give you something you might need in return. Think of it as a trade." Emily's jaw tightened, her suspicion now mixed with irritation. "I'm not interested in being anyone's charity case." "It's not charity," John said sharply, pulling into the parking lot of an upscale restaurant. He parked and turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "It's business. And I think you'll want to hear me out." Emily glanced at the restaurant, her brow furrowing. "I'm not dressed for this," she said, gesturing to her worn clothes. John shrugged. "We're not here for dinner. This is just a place where we can talk without being disturbed." Reluctantly, Emily followed him inside. The restaurant staff greeted John with practiced deference. barely glancing at Emily as they were escorted to a private booth. She noticed the curious stares of a few patrons but ignored them, focusing instead on John as he settled into the seat across from her. John leaned back, his sharp gaze fixed on her. "I need an heir," he began bluntly. "A child to carry my name and inherit what I've built. But I'm not interested in the complications of a traditional relationship. I want a clean, straightforward arrangement." Emily blinked, momentarily stunned by his candor. "And what does that have to do with me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the shock. "I want you to carry my child," John said, his tone as calm as if he were discussing a business merger. "In return, I'll ensure you're provided for financially, medically, and otherwise. Once the child is born, you'll receive a substantial payment, enough to change your circumstances permanently." Emily's jaw dropped, disbelief flickering across her face. "You want me to have your baby, like a business deal?" "Exactly," John said without hesitation. "You'd have no further obligations after the child is born. It would be my responsibility, not yours." Emily stared at him, her mind racing. The audacity of his proposal was almost laughable. Yet there was a cold logic to it. Still, the idea of reducing something as profound as childbirth to a mere transaction made her stomach churn. "You think you can just buy people like that," she said, her voice sharp. John leaned forward, his expression unyielding. "I think survival has a price. Emily, yours might be this. No more struggling on the streets. No more wondering where your next meal will come from. This isn't charity, it's an opportunity." Emily's hands clenched into fists under the table. She wanted to reject him outright, to tell him exactly what she thought of his arrogance. But his words hit a nerve. Life on the streets had stripped her of illusions about fairness. The promise of security, of a way out, was painfully tempting. "And after the child is born," she asked cautiously, her voice quieter now, "what happens to me?" "You'd be free to go," John said. "The payment would be yours, and there would be no further ties between us." Emily frowned, her mind racing. The offer was cold, clinical, and deeply unsettling. But it was also a chance to escape the relentless grind of survival. Still, she wasn't ready to trust him. "I don't trust you," she said finally, her voice firm. "I wouldn't expect you to," John replied evenly. "That's why there will be a legally binding contract to protect both of us. You'll have access to the best lawyers to ensure your terms are met." Silence hung between them as Emily processed his words. Her instinct was to walk away, to cling to the shards of pride she had left. But the desperation of her situation loomed over her like a shadow. Finally, she exhaled, meeting his gaze with a steely resolve. "I'll hear you out," she said. "But don't think for a second that I trust you." John allowed himself a faint smile, a flicker of satisfaction crossing his face. "Fair enough." For the first time, Emily felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Whether it was toward salvation or disaster, she couldn't yet tell. But as she left the restaurant that night with John's proposition echoing in her mind, she knew one thing for certain: her life was about to change forever. The air in the office was sterile, with the faint hum of an air conditioning unit filling the silence. Emily sat across from John at a long, polished mahogany conference table. The stark contrast between their worlds made glaringly clear. Everything about this place, its pristine surfaces, understated luxury, and the quiet efficiency of the staff seemed designed to radiate power. And power was what John Carter exuded, even as he sat silently at the head of the table, studying her with a calm, unflinching gaze. Between them lay a neatly bound contract, thick with legal jargon and bullet points. The document was the culmination of hours of negotiation, revisions, and reassurances. John had spared no expense, hiring top-tier legal counsel to draft a binding agreement that outlined every aspect of the arrangement. For Emily, it was both a shield and a reminder of the transaction she was about to enter into. The lawyer John had hired to represent Emily, a sharp-eyed woman named Karen who spoke in measured tones, was seated beside her. Flipping through the final pages of the contract. "The terms are straightforward," Karen said, her voice cutting through the tension. "You'll receive a monthly stipend, housing, full medical coverage throughout the pregnancy, and a lump sum payment upon delivery. In return, you relinquish any parental rights after the child is born. The child will be under Mr. Carter's sole custody." Emily nodded, her fingers drumming lightly on the table. The terms weren't a surprise, she had read through every clause multiple times. But knowing them and accepting them were two different things. "And what happens if something goes wrong?" Emily asked, her voice steady but edged with caution. "What if I change my mind, or if he does?" Karen glanced at John, her expression neutral. "The contract accounts for that. If you fail to fulfill your part of the agreement without medical justification, you forfeit the payment. Conversely, if Mr. Carter fails to uphold his obligations, there are financial penalties, including compensation for damages." John leaned forward slightly, his calm gaze meeting Emily's. "I won't fail, Emily. That's not how I operate." His confidence grated on her nerves, but she forced herself to stay composed. "I have a condition," she said suddenly, her voice firm. Karen raised an eyebrow, and even John seemed momentarily intrigued. "Go on," he said. Emily took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "I want to meet the child. Not often, once or twice a year. Maybe. I don't want to be a stranger." John's expression hardened, and for a moment, Emily thought he might refuse outright. But then, to her surprise, he nodded. "Agreed," he said evenly. "The contract can specify limited visitation rights." Emily exhaled, some of the tension in her shoulders easing. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give her a sense of connection to the life she would bring into the world. "There's one more thing," she added. "I want to say in the medical process. If I'm putting my body through this, I deserve that much." John didn't hesitate this time. "That's reasonable," he said. "You'll have access to the best medical professionals, and your preferences will be accommodated." Karen made notes on the contract, her pen moving briskly across the page. Emily watched her, feeling both relieved and uneasy. This was real, far more real than it had been when John first approached her on the street. She was stepping into uncharted territory, placing her trust in a man she barely knew. "Any other questions or concerns?" John asked, his tone more neutral now. Emily hesitated, then shook her head. "No. I think that's it." Karen slid the revised contract toward her, along with a pen. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on Emily's chest. This decision would change her life, for better or worse. She glanced at John, his expression as composed as ever. "You'll keep your word?" she asked quietly. John nodded, his voice steady. "I always do." Taking a deep breath, Emily picked up the pen and signed her name at the bottom of the page. The act felt both empowering and terrifying, a leap into an unknown future. As she set the pen down, John extended a hand across the table. "To a successful partnership," he said, his voice cool but sincere. Emily hesitated for only a moment before shaking his hand. His grip was firm, unyielding, and she couldn't help but wonder what she had just agreed to. For the first time, a flicker of hope joined the unease swirling in her chest. Maybe this was her chance to reclaim her life. But as she left the office that day, clutching her copy of the contract, she couldn't shake the feeling that this deal was only the beginning and that the road ahead would be far more complicated than either of them anticipated. Emily adjusted to her new life with a mix of wonder and unease. The townhouse John had provided for her was breathtakingly luxurious, a far cry from the noisy, chaotic streets she had once called home. The sleek furniture, state-of-the-art appliances, and meticulously designed interiors made her feel like an outsider in her own space. The refrigerator was always stocked with gourmet food. Her closet was filled with expensive new clothes. and the silence was almost oppressive. For someone who had grown accustomed to the constant noise of the city streets, the quiet felt almost alien. To ground herself, Emily turned to her art. The spare room in the townhouse quickly transformed into her studio. Sketches covered the walls, spilling across tables and countertops. Her hands, often smudged with charcoal or paint, found solace in creating. She drew memories of people she had met on the streets, abstract expressions of her emotions, and even hopeful scenes of the future. It was her way of holding on to her identity, a reminder that she was more than a vessel for someone else's ambitions. John, meanwhile, remained a distant figure, true to his nature. He treated the arrangement with professional detachment. He visited occasionally, always accompanied by a doctor or a lawyer. His questions clipped and clinical. "How are you feeling? Is the baby developing on schedule?" His demeanor was efficient, precise, and devoid of warmth. Emily bristled at his coldness but told herself that it was better this way. After all, this was a business deal, not a relationship. But one day, something changed. John arrived unexpectedly, unaccompanied by his usual entourage. He found Emily in her makeshift studio, her back to him as she worked on a large mural. The painting was vivid and raw, an explosion of colors and shapes that seemed to pulse with emotion. Emily didn't notice him at first, so engrossed was she in her work. When she finally turned, she saw him standing there, his gaze fixed on the mural. "What is all this?" he asked, his tone softer than usual. Emily hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "Just something to keep me sane," she replied, wiping her hands on her apron. John stepped closer, studying the intricate details of her work. "It's impressive," he admitted. "I didn't know you were an artist." "There's a lot you don't know about me," Emily said, her voice laced with quiet defiance. The remark lingered in the air, heavier than either of them expected. For the first time, John felt a flicker of curiosity about her. She wasn't just the woman carrying his child, she was someone with depth. Someone who had faced unimaginable hardships and yet found a way to create beauty. It unsettled him more than he cared to admit. As the pregnancy progressed, their interactions grew less formal. Emily, never one to hold back, began to challenge John in ways he wasn't accustomed to. During one visit, she questioned his motives, her hands resting protectively on her growing belly. "You're so obsessed with control," she said, her tone sharp. "Have you ever thought about what happens when things don't go according to plan?" John frowned, his gaze narrowing. "That's why I plan meticulously, to avoid surprises." Emily laughed softly, shaking her head. "Life doesn't care about your plans. John, look at me. Do you think I planned to end up homeless? To be sitting here, doing this?" Her words struck a nerve, though John didn't show it. For all his success, he knew she was right. Life had thrown him curveballs. 2 failed marriages. The loneliness he refused to admit to himself. But unlike Emily, he had always responded by tightening his grip on control, not letting go. Their bond deepened in subtle ways. John began visiting more frequently, sometimes staying longer than necessary. He brought books about parenting, which Emily read voraciously, much to his surprise. In return, she teased him about his dry reading choices, recommending novels and art books. Once, on a rare evening when they lingered in the living room, Emily played a simple melody on an old guitar she had salvaged from a thrift store. John didn't say anything, but she noticed the way he lingered by the door before leaving, as if reluctant to go. One day, during a routine checkup, the doctor mentioned the baby's strong heartbeat. For John, who had always viewed the pregnancy in abstract terms, the sound stirred something unexpected, a flicker of emotion he couldn't quite name. Later, as they left the clinic, Emily handed him a small sketch she had drawn of what she imagined the baby might look like. "Just thought you'd like to see," she said casually, but there was a softness in her voice that caught him off guard. John stared at the sketch for a long moment before slipping it into his pocket. That night, he placed it on his desk, next to the framed photographs of his corporate achievements. As Emily entered her third trimester, the walls they had both carefully built began to crack. John started asking her about her life, her art, her struggles, and what had kept her going despite everything. Emily, in turn, caught glimpses of the man behind the calculated exterior. Beneath his stoicism was someone who longed for connection but had spent his life running from it. Their relationship remained complicated, rooted in the transaction that had brought them together. But moments of genuine connection, shared laughter, quiet conversations, or unspoken understanding began to redefine the terms of their partnership. Emily's resilience, her ability to find beauty in chaos, challenged John in ways he hadn't expected. And as the due date approached, he found himself wondering if this child, this arrangement, might represent more than just a continuation of his legacy. It might be a chance to rewrite his own story. The early morning light streamed through the hospital windows, casting a muted glow over the sterile corridors. John paced outside the delivery room, his polished shoes clicking against the tiles in a rhythm that betrayed his otherwise composed exterior. Despite his usual air of control, his mind raced with a chaotic mix of anticipation, fear, and hope. The muffled sounds from inside the room, Emily's cries of effort, and the murmurs of the medical team only heightened his sense of helplessness. For the first time in years, John felt powerless. When the nurse emerged, her face calm and professional, she motioned for him to enter. John inhaled deeply, bracing himself, before stepping into the room. The dim lighting softened the sharp edges of the medical equipment, but nothing could prepare him for the sight before him. Emily lay back on the hospital bed, her face flushed and glistening with sweat. But her expression was one of quiet triumph. Cradled in her arms was the tiny life that had been the catalyst for this entire journey. Emily looked up and met John's gaze. A faint, exhausted smile played on her lips. "Come on," she said, her voice hoarse but warm. "Meet your son." The word struck John like a thunderbolt, grounding him in a reality he had scarcely allowed himself to imagine. Slowly, he approached the bed, each step heavy with the weight of the moment. Emily shifted slightly, offering him a clearer view of the baby. The child was impossibly small, his face red and scrunched as he squirmed lightly in the blanket. Tiny fingers peeked out, grasping at the air, and John found himself staring, transfixed. This was his heir, his blood, his legacy. But as he looked closer, something deeper stirred within him. It wasn't just the knowledge that this child would carry his name, it was the overwhelming connection he felt. A surge of protectiveness and wonder that left him breathless. "His perfect," Emily murmured, her gaze soft as she watched John. Her voice broke through his thoughts. And for a moment, he couldn't speak. His throat tightened, and he felt an unfamiliar sting in his eyes. "May I?" he asked finally, his voice barely audible. Emily nodded, carefully transferring the baby into John's arms. The weight of the tiny life was both delicate and profound. As John held his son for the first time, he felt a crack form in the walls he had spent a lifetime building. In that moment, the child wasn't just an extension of his empire, he was something far more precious, a symbol of hope, of possibility, of redemption. Hours passed in a blur. John remained by Emily's side, the baby resting peacefully in a bassinet nearby. The medical staff came and went, offering congratulations and ensuring Emily's comfort. But John barely noticed them. His attention was consumed entirely by the child and the gravity of what had just unfolded. "How are you feeling?" he asked Emily, his voice gentle in a way she hadn't heard before. "Tired," she admitted with a small laugh. "But good. Really good." John nodded, his gaze drifting back to the bassinet. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." Emily smiled faintly, her exhaustion evident. "You've said that before. This time, I mean it more," John replied, his tone earnest. 4 years. He had told himself that this arrangement was purely about legacy, about ensuring that what he had built didn't die with him. But now, standing in this room, it felt like something more, something far more personal and profound. In the days that followed, John found himself re-evaluating everything he thought he knew. Holding his son, watching Emily interact with the baby, and reflecting on the journey they had shared forced him to confront truths he had long avoided. His son wasn't just a continuation of his name or a means of preserving his empire. He was a person, a tiny, vulnerable life filled with limitless potential. And Emily wasn't merely the woman who had carried his child, she was someone who had shown him resilience, kindness, and the importance of connection. One evening, as he stood by the nursery window in the townhouse, cradling his son in his arms, John felt a rare sense of peace. The room, decorated in soft tones of blue and white, was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile environments he was used to. The baby stirred, letting out a small coo, and John smiled, marveling at how something so small could have such a profound impact on his life. When Emily walked into the room, she paused, watching him. Her heart ached at the sight of this powerful, guarded man, so utterly captivated by the child they had brought into the world. "You're a natural," she said softly. John looked up, a rare smile touching his lips. "I'm learning." Emily stepped closer, her gaze lingering on the baby before meeting John's. "So, what now?" John exhaled, the weight of the question lifting from his chest. "Now," he said, "we figure it out together." It wasn't a definitive answer, but it was enough. For the first time in years, John felt a glimmer of hope, not just for his son's future, but for his own. Emily had shown him that love and connection weren't weaknesses, they were the very things that made life worth living. And as he looked down at his son, he knew that this child wasn't just his legacy, it was his second chance. The townhouse had never felt so alive. The once pristine, almost sterile space was now filled with the sounds of life, a baby's soft coos, the quiet murmur of conversation, and the occasional hum of a lullaby from Emily's lips. The baby's arrival had transformed not only the home but also the dynamics between John and Emily. Where there had once been cold formality, there was now a tentative warmth, a growing sense of mutual understanding. John found himself drawn to the nursery more often than he expected. He would stand by the crib, watching his son sleep, his tiny chest rising and falling in a rhythm that never failed to calm him. It was a stark contrast to the man he had been, a man who thrived on control, ambition, and a relentless drive for success. Now, in these quiet moments, he found himself questioning everything he thought he valued. One evening, as he rocked the baby to sleep, Emily entered the room, carrying a steaming mug of tea. She leaned against the doorframe, watching John with a faint smile. "You've come a long way," she said softly. John glanced up, his expression thoughtful. "It's strange," he admitted. "For so long, I thought legacy was about buildings, businesses, achievements. But now, it feels like it's about him." Emily nodded, stepping closer. "Legacy isn't just what you leave behind. It's the love and lessons you pass on, the things that shape who they'll become." Her words stayed with John, lingering in his thoughts as he navigated the delicate balance of this new life. He began to see Emily not just as the woman who had carried his child, but as a partner in a journey he hadn't fully anticipated. Her resilience, her warmth, and her ability to find beauty in chaos had become a source of inspiration. In turn, Emily saw a side of John that few others ever glimpsed. Beneath his composed exterior was a man grappling with vulnerability, a man slowly allowing himself to connect with something beyond his empire. It wasn't always easy. John's instincts for control sometimes clashed with Emily's independent spirit, but they were learning to navigate these differences with patience and a surprising sense of humor. One morning, as they sat together in the living room, Emily flipped through a sketchbook while John sipped his coffee. "I've been thinking about something," she said, her tone hesitant. John raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "I want to pursue my art," she said, glancing at him. "Seriously this time. Not just for myself. But, maybe to show people what I see. What I've experienced." John set his coffee cup down. His gaze steady. "You should," he said simply. "You're talented. People need to see that." Emily blinked, caught off guard by his encouragement. "You think so?" "I know so," John replied. "And if you need connections or resources, I can help." Emily smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen not just as the mother of his child, but as a person with her own dreams and potential. As the months passed, they found a rhythm. John handled the logistics, appointments, financial planning, and ensuring the townhouse was always stocked with everything they needed. Emily focused on raising their son and developing her art, her confidence growing with each new piece she completed. Together, they celebrated milestones: the baby's first smile, his first laugh, and his first wobbly attempts to sit up. Their bond deepened with every shared moment. They weren't a conventional family by any means, but they had become something close to it, partners in a journey they hadn't expected but had come to cherish. On the baby's first birthday, they celebrated with a quiet evening at home. Emily baked a simple cake, and John set up a camera to capture the moment. As their son giggled and smeared frosting across his face, the room filled with laughter and a sense of joy that was unmistakably genuine. Later that night, as the baby slept soundly in his crib, John and Emily sat together on the porch, a bottle of wine between them. The stars above were bright, casting a soft glow over the city skyline. "This isn't what I expected," John said, his voice low. "But I think it's exactly what I needed." Emily nodded, her gaze fixed on the stars. "Me too," she said softly. In that moment, the complications of their arrangement faded into the background. What remained was a connection built on trust, respect, and the shared love for the little life they had brought into the world. It wasn't perfect, and the future still held uncertainties, but they had found something worth holding on to: a partnership, a family, and a second chance at building a life that truly mattered. As the gentle hum of the baby monitor filled the quiet townhouse, John and Emily sat together in the living room, reflecting on the unexpected journey that had brought them here. What began as a cold, calculated arrangement had transformed into something profound: a partnership built on trust, mutual respect, and a shared love for the child who now brought light into their lives. John looked at his son sleeping peacefully in the crib and smiled, realizing that legacy wasn't about wealth or achievements, it was about love, connection, and the moments that truly mattered. Emily, too, had found a renewed sense of purpose, her art now a testament to resilience and hope. Their story is a powerful reminder that life often takes us on paths we never planned, leading to lessons we didn't know we needed. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Life Stories for more tales of transformation and triumph.